the distinguished Tahrir Dialogue Series, which I'm very proud to boast is holding its 101 session this afternoon. As has been the tradition, the Tahrir Dialogues are meant to be special.
إن ندوات سلسلة حوار التحرير تتحدث عن موضوعات متخصصة، وخاصة إذا كان الأمر له علاقة بالمصلحة العامة ويحظى باهتمام الجمهور. نحن نقيم حوارا يحترم الأبعاد الأكاديمية وفي نفس الوقت نخاطب المجتمع والأكاديميين بشكل عام، ولأننا كلية الشؤون الدولية والسياسات العامة دائما ما نركز كل فترة وأخرى على الموضوعات المتعلقة بمصر، ولكن لدينا ميل طبعا أن نتناول قضايا متعددة لها علاقة بالشؤون الدولية. وبالنسبة لهذه الجلسة اليوم أود أن أقول أنه يسعدني ويشرفني، يسعدني لأن الموضوع الذي سنتناوله هو
and in the requirements for any progress in dealing with this issue. So nothing can be more topical to everybody around town or the region or the globe than the issue at hand now. And we will be holding several different sessions on this as we get closer to November when Egypt hosts the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. The reason I'm honored is to be able to have two extremely distinguished speakers with us today. Undersecretary Dr. Vera Songwe, the UN Undersecretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. Dr. Songwe has a long CV of contributions in the development area, focusing on public policy advice in particular, and with a focus on trying to achieve results and progress in Africa in particular. She's been mentioned numerously in terms of her influence as among the most powerful women in Africa and in the world and so on. But I actually say without any hesitation at all, I was extremely attracted to her because of the merits of her contributions over the years. Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin, many different things to say about him. He's a personal friend, a gentleman that I worked with for years in the past and continue to appreciate and admire. He is presently the UN Special Envoy on Financing in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. He's also the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP27. Dr. Muhyiddin had previously worked at the World Bank, is presently at IMF, and has been a minister in the Egyptian government. Over and above all that, some of which, at least government service, we have in common. He's also a university professor and therefore has a special talent in respecting academic rigor as well. He's a university professor at Cairo University. The two distinguished panelists will speak first, then my collaborator on this event, Dean Adham Ramadan, the Dean for Graduate Studies and Research, and I may pose a question or two to the panelists, or the speakers, excuse me, after which we will reach into the audience. The audience is free to either use the raise hand feature, and I'll try to do that in some order, or send in questions on the chat, and we'll take a couple of questions at a time. So why don't, I know Dr. Muhyiddin may have to leave us a little bit early, so I just wanted to mention that, but I think we have enough time to listen to Dr. Songwe and Dr. Muhyiddin before we get into that phase of the process. Dr. Songwe, can I invite you to start the session?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Fahmy, for the invitation, first of all, to speak at the very prestigious and very famous, renowned American University in Cairo. It's a pleasure. It's actually unfortunate I actually called to see if we were actually driving there, The Zoom has democratized us, and so good afternoon everybody else that is listening to us, because it allows us to reach as many people as possible, but it keeps us apart. And so hopefully next time around we will be able to meet in person when we have a little bit of a longer time here. Of course, in Ramadan, thank you very much as well for being with us and for giving us your time. This was, as is the same with you, Din Fahmy, Dr. Mahmoud Muhyiddin is a friend, a mentor, advisor, and a colleague. And when he said, come to Egypt with me, you know, we got on the train and the bus and we are here. So hopefully this is a really, really prestigious and honored talk that we're giving. And really because Dr. Muhyiddin is, of course, the advisor to the Egyptian government and the president on COP27, our job as the UN, he also advises us, and our job as the UN is really to begin to see how as the executive secretary for the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, that hosts the Africa Climate Policy Center, is really to see how we make this COP, one, an implementation COP, but also a COP that really responds and begins to put Africa's agenda at the fore of the conversation. I have 12 minutes. My talk today is going to sort of talk about 3 big issues around the COP, and then propose some solutions, how we can actually not just talk about the solutions, we begin demonstrating that they're workable solutions by implementing them and hopefully delivering something concrete as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh in November. So just a brief overview about, you know, Africa and climate change. We are 17% of the global population, less than 4% of global emissions. Actually, South Africa, Nigeria, and 2 or 3 other countries make up for more than 2% of the 4%. So the rest of the countries on the continent really are emitting less than 0.23% each. We have clearly the continent that is suffering the most from the impacts of climate change. We are projected to lose anywhere from 2 to 5% of our GDP because of climate change. Countries like Mozambique are already spending 5 to 15% of their GDP on the impacts of climate change on their economies. As we saw recently, we've seen all of East Africa with the locusts and the droughts last year also at 5 to 7% of their GDP. But we also saw a huge, I think Africa as a continent was one of the first countries that stepped up in Paris to sign the climate agreements and the Paris agreements, and essentially to say, yes, we believe that we could do something to mitigate a rising temperature by 2050. And actually we proposed and offered NDCs. 43 African countries submitted NDCs, revised NDCs before the Paris Agreement. And as we speak today, almost all countries have submitted their national determined contributions, which is normally called NDCs, which is essentially what countries offer as what they're going to do to reduce the pressure on the climate. Of course, countries offer these national determined contributions, but the national determined contributions are actions that countries have to take to reduce their impact on climate change. It costs money to do that, right? It's essentially replacing development as we've always known it, development as we're doing it, for a different kind of development. For Africa, our NDCs as they were presented cost about $1.3 trillion. This was over the Paris Agreement. Of course, since then they have all increased. But since Paris, we've only gotten about 6 billion in resources for climate finance, and clearly we're very, very far behind. We have now noticed that, you know, if we continue to just talk about the promises of Paris, the 100 billion that was meant to come from donor aid, we may never get those resources, particularly that since Paris, we have had the financial crisis, we've had a COVID crisis, and now we have the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. So one of the conversations that we've been looking at is to say, can we move from donor mechanisms that finance climate change and help Africa adapt and mitigate climate to maybe a combination of donor resources, own country resources, which we're already spending 5 to 15% of our GDP, but also market mechanisms and prices that will allow us in a level playing competitive field to actually access markets and have some resources to respond to the climate change. What are the three big issues? And I'll talk about three big issues that Africa, as we go towards COP 27 in Sham, is looking at. The first one, of course, is the energy transition. We know that Africa does not yet produce enough energy to power its industry and to supply just the demand for its people. Yes, we always talk about what percentage of the population has access to energy, including in Egypt. And in Egypt, it's about 99% of the population has access to energy. We don't talk about what is the amount of energy we need to actually transition into the fourth industrial revolution, to have the kind of resources that power our industry, power our services sector in the way that is required for any other developed economy. So we are very, very far away from what we need by way of energy to get there. 78% of the population, over 560 million people, are essentially without access to reliable, sustainable, affordable energy across the continent. For many people, even as they do agriculture, even as they do digitization, they still don't have the energy that is needed. And so one of the big issues that we must compute with is what kinds of transition fuels do we need. Gas, for example, is an important transition fuel. This is a big issue for Africa as we go to COP, but maybe a big issue now with everything else that's happening in Ukraine. I think the idea, maybe in November or September last year, we were talking about gas as the just transition. Today we hear from Europe gas as a security issue. Energy security has become primordial, and maybe with that we will get more investment in gas. Africa today only consumes 3.3% of the global gas that is available. If we were able to consume as much gas as we have, we will actually be able to speed up our development, but only add 4% to global emissions. And this is the debate, right? Is how much more global emissions can we add for Africa to become prosperous? With the argument that when Africa becomes prosperous, it's faster than actually for us to improve on our climate habits. The other key issue is around mitigation is, what do we do? Many other countries have different kinds of base loads for their energy. For Africa, gas is an essential, immediate base load that we can already begin to use. Yes, eventually for countries like Egypt and Namibia and others, we will do hydrogen, but hydrogen is extremely expensive. The infrastructure needs to be put together. How much is it going to cost, and what is it going to take for us to ensure that we can do that? The second key issue is adaptation, loss, and damage. Excluding many of the countries in North Africa, Africa's adaptation cost is anywhere between $30 to $40 billion. If you look at all the international efforts that have been put to cost adaptation, we would say it's about $50 billion a year. Africa needs investments of over 1.3 trillion of adaptation by 2030 in order to implement all of its national determined contribution, but less than 20% of those global adaptation finances flow to Africa. We just came from the central bank, where essentially we were talking about the fact that, when there are tensions or crises from other parts of the world, it actually hits our continent, which means that we need to divert resources from what we were already planning to do to respond to this crisis. So even with the resources that we have to put towards adaptation, we do not have the right amount of resources. We're going to see growing food insecurity because of the crisis now in Russia and Ukraine. And then what is the conversation? Do we have a conversation around a different, renewed kind of agriculture that is also climate sensitive, or do we just go ahead and say we need to ensure food security and those tensions that Africa has to face, and where do we find the pricing for that? We know that climate change is going to be an important component of our food security conversations. By 2050, climate change would negatively affect our agricultural crops by up to 22%. So sorghum production is going to go down by 17%, granule production by 18%, maize production by 22%. So it is not just that we don't have the resources to be able to increase the food production, but even with those resources, if we are not able to improve on the climate, the productivity of those resources will go down, which essentially means throwing good money after bad. So how do we work through the science and the technology? And in FAMI, we're talking about the academic work that is needed on our own continent to do the research, to begin to find more resistant crops to ensure that we can respond adequately. The third issue is the weak outcomes from COP26. Yes, I know there's a lot of conversation around the country platforms, and maybe Mahmoud will talk about it, and the 8.5 billion to South Africa for its exiting in coal, but there's not many African countries that are using coal. We would have wanted, as Africa coming out of COP26, to have a lot more conversations around Article 6, market-based mechanisms for carbon pricing. However, all we got was just pledges. There was no commitment to double the adaptation finance, no clear mechanisms to halt deforestation by 2030, the finalization of the rule book on Article 6 to facilitate carbon trading, a standardization of carbon trading regulations and rules was not achieved. For example, we have very successful big firms in Europe that have signed voluntary agreements that are buying carbon on the continent for $5 and buying carbon in Europe for $75. This kinds of inequity. So already there is the inequity of the fact that we didn't benefit as much from a changing climate in our development process. But the fact that even as we have protected the climate, because buying carbon from us means we've protected the climate a little bit more, we are paying less than those who had contributed to damage the climate. So we do need some conversations. The Glasgow Climate Pact recognized that limiting global warming to 1.5 by 2100 requires more action. This crisis clearly is taking us back. What more do we need to do to ensure that we can at least overcome that? The first thing that clearly needs to be done is to focus on the green recovery. We have just produced a report, and I'll leave it with you, Dean Pami, that demonstrates that actually a green recovery is possible because a green recovery is more resilient, it creates better jobs, and it actually makes growth faster. We showed that in South Africa, for example, we could create 250 more jobs if the government of South Africa focused on a green recovery, and actually it's that report that was shared at COP26 and part of the conversations that happened there. We showed in Egypt in that report, and we'll share it with you so you can share with the colleagues online, that 150% more value added could be gotten from the economies of Egypt if Egypt decided to do a greener recovery, 55% more jobs in the short term in Egypt if you took a green recovery path. So there are ways to recovering better, there are ways to recovering stronger through a green agenda, but they also require additional resources, hence the need at the end of the day for these market mechanisms that will allow us to be able to go to the markets and price carbon. The other and final comment is, in terms of the carbon pricing, in terms of how one raises resources for carbon, Egypt is one of the rare African countries that has issued green bonds. But today, even when we issue green bonds on the continent, we being Africa, the returns or the cost of those bonds still remain quite high. So we don't get any additional discounts because we've issued a green bond compared to when a Europe or European country does that. So there is more work that needs to be done around the environment, the social, but also the financial part to ensure that Africa is rewarded for green bonds. Africa is rewarded actually for doing all the work that it's doing. We are now leading a conversation around the peatlands. The peatlands of the Congo and the Congo Basin sequester almost 3 years of carbon. If today we were to burn down the peatlands, forget the conversation around climate change, we will get to 2% within 3 months. And so essentially, if Africa were to monetize this effort that it has made to sequester that much carbon and protect the world from an increasingly hotter climate, then we can have a lot more resources and much faster to catch up with our growth and probably reduce the climate impact of Africa in the world. So on that note, I think there is a lot that we can do going to COP. We can, again, as part of the projects that we're working on, there's a conversation around debt for climate swaps. There's a conversation around how we reduce the cost of market access around green bonds and how we can structure them. There's a big conversation around the environmental, social, and governance processes that are going to agree to what is a green bond, what is a sustainable bond, what are the governance issues around verification and pricing and demonstration of project monitoring. So I think one of the things that we're doing today is socializing these concepts in Africa and hoping that as we get to COP, Africa takes a commanding seat at the table and is actually able to influence the decisions that are made, but also present some projects in terms of what it is doing to contribute to a better climate. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Undersecretary Sangui. Thank you very much. Very direct points raised as well as suggestions made. I don't want to get into a summary of what you said because you were so eloquent and and precise, but I also want to manage time as much as I can. And therefore, I'll give the opportunity to Dr. Muhyiddin to share his reflections and comments. And then we'll come back to both of you with some commentary from either Dean Ramadan and myself or the audience. Dr. Muhyiddin.
Right. Thank you so much, Excellency Dean Fahmy, for inviting me to participate in this important discussion with my good friend and sister, Dr. Vera Songwe. And many thanks as well for Dean Ramadan to join us in this discussion today. As always, Vera managed to cover the critical issues very well. And that may make my life easier or more difficult. We'll see. First, I'd like just to put a kind of a context on the kind of global political economy dynamics that Egypt is hosting COP27 within them. We all remember that COP26 was postponed for a year because of one major crisis that is not over yet, which is the COVID-19 crisis. Now we still have the implications of COVID-19. Some countries are still suffering from the health crisis associated with it, including in some countries in the Eastern Hemisphere. We see recommendations again to have the fourth booster for those who had the 3 doses. With that, we have many challenges facing the global economy because of what happened during the COVID crisis, including accumulating debt challenges. Then more recently, I think this is the 7th week since we stopped to see the hostilities in the Ukraine, with serious implications on food, fuel, and financial challenges. Very strong reminder of similar crises that the world went through in 2007 and 2008. And coming from that farming background that I have, I would add as well the challenges facing access to critical fertilizers. So it's 4 Fs, not 3 Fs when it comes to implications of the Ukraine crisis. You'll be getting in the coming couple of weeks many reports from the World Bank, from the IMF, from other IFI's reports during the spring meetings, talking about a perfect storm. And this is the second perfect storm after another perfect storm that the world has gone through, with major casualties and major negative implications. In this kind of environment, considering what we should be doing differently and better to push the agenda for sustainability at large and climate change, that is for some people being considered as a kind of a midterm to long-term kind of a challenge, is a big issue. And then we need really to remind ourselves that it's not really by the end of the century we are going to be suffering from the deterioration in climate or the impact of climate change. It's basically, as being reported recently by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Report on Climate Change, the scientific one, that we are not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement. We are not on track to reduce emissions as promised by everyone since Paris, and more recently in Glasgow, by no less than 45%. By 2030, actually, we're adding 14%, so we are deviating by 60%. And if people wonder about the impact of that on nature, on production of different crops, in safety of people and the planet, and the many reports about floods, hurricanes, storms of intense severity, they are all, the scientists say, they are all attributed to that climate change, that we're not doing much yet, despite the pledges to deal with. So I think we need to put it in that context, because in order to reach a deal in the formal tent of the discussions, which is basically between the negotiators through their NDCs, is going to be even more difficult this time compared to Paris and compared to Glasgow, because of this kind of an atmosphere of war and distrust in the global political system. Another aspect that I like to emphasize, that developing economies, including the African economies, had enough of many pledges and promises to do this and to do that, but then at the end, the delivery was leaving a lot to be desired. So it is not a surprise to see that the Egyptian presidency is expecting that this summit is going to be on actions, on delivery, on projects, rather than commitments, more commitments and pledges. So we need here to see how can we projectize all of these kind of claims and pledges. How can we get the commitments made by governments or by the business sector and the financial institutions to be reflected in the field, not just in Africa, but in the whole world. So this would require lots of work from now until November. This is basically what we are trying to do in order to encourage more of matchmaking between the supply of finance and investments and the kind of investable and bankable projects. But this will be really essential for any kind of a consideration of the summit in Sharm to be a successful one. This summit as well is expected to be adopting a more holistic approach to dealing with sustainability. We have been suffering from a kind of a reductionist approach to sustainability, from sustainability to mean SDGs at large. Now we're talking about climate, and even climate, we're only focusing on part of it in mitigation. And as mentioned by Vera, there are a lot of issues related to adaptation and the loss and damage file that have been left without any kind of serious consideration, including on the kind of investments and finance required for them. In mitigation, we have been seeing some progress, not enough, but at least we saw the progress. You see the investments in renewables, in solar and wind, including in Africa, in different places, including in our country here in Egypt, in Morocco, and all over the continent. But the trouble really comes when you need to consider more funding for adaptation, and with the portfolio even coming from the MDBs, from the multilateral development banks, is more towards mitigation and less so when it comes to agriculture, food management, water management, infrastructure protection of shores, and the likes of activities that have more public benefit than the private benefit. That will be really a very serious discussion to have, and hopefully more projects as well to be supported. Adding to that, the loss and damage file had been a very contentious and controversial file, with three approaches about them: neglected. The second one, okay, make some sort of recognition, but put it within the adaptation file. The third is basically to push hard, which is basically the view of the developing economies. Those, as mentioned by Vera, like in Africa, are not emitting more than 4% for the whole continent, but still are required to contribute as if they are responsible for the mess that we're in. So that is going to be a very important file. While it's going to be happening in the formal tent, I'm always trying to describe the summit in three tents: the formal one, which is basically the negotiators; the non-state actors that I represent them in as a champion. This is the title, not me as a description of what I'm doing, but this is the title for the climate change coordinators, as they call them, the climate champions. It sounds impressive in English and even more impressive in Arabic when you talk about رائد المناخ. My daughter jokes about it like رائد الفضاء, with the astronaut. But anyways, it's a kind of a very big challenging job that one has to do. Anyways, coming close then, this is the kind of context that we need to have this holistic approach more in the implementation rather than claims and pledges and commitments without implementation. And then managing the transition. This is a very critical topic that even OECD countries we saw in Europe, they messed it up as well. They didn't manage the transition well. They didn't phase themselves out from the hydrocarbon-based sources of energy, and they didn't have the substitutes. And even before, they cannot blame it on Ukraine, because even before Ukraine, we have seen what so-called then greenflation. We have seen many issues about the increases in the prices of the fuel mix. Then finance, how to finance all of what Vera mentioned. We are not in a position to rely more on debt, because most of the, if not all, I would say, of the middle income and low income countries have reached debt limits that they don't need really to go beyond them for them to be more vulnerable. So the only way is to start seeing how long-term finance can leverage the private sector and to invest rather than lend into activities. This requires a great deal of work on data systems, on de-risking, and in sharing information about what's really happening. And we know all that the perception of risk in Africa, as an example, because the focus today is in Africa, but this is the same for other developing economies, the perception of risk is much higher than reality. But that needs really better information, better data system, and better monitoring and evaluation of what's happening in the field. Then this gets me into the last point with this opportunity to speak to a prestigious academic institution. Where is the role of science, academicians, and research institutions of all of that? Talk about data, we talk about finance, we talk about implementation, and there is a very big role for research institutions for this. One of the good outcomes from the COP26 hosted in Glasgow is to have this network of British universities led by co-chairs from Imperial College and Cambridge University that produced variety of technical support and policy briefs, hosting events, getting students to be more aware, and starting by themselves in making their own universities compatible with what's required for the climate change initiatives. So this is one area. The second is basically to use the scientific arguments to convince policymakers and business community to do more. Third is the role of scientists and researchers is not just about diagnosis, but basically about providing solutions. Now we can talk about solar energy, for instance, because thanks to research and development and partnership between business and academia, now the cost of solar is 95% less of what it used to be 10 years ago. This is just an example. Wind is doing fine as well, but not as good as solar. So here is basically how to unleash the potential of professors, of students in getting this issue of sustainability very seriously in their work and mainstream it in their curriculum. I know that there are specialists in this field, but there are two aspects. I think Vera as well mentioned the issue of digitalization and sustainability should be really mainstreamed regardless the specialization and the topic of interest for students and researchers and top academics. Having said that, if matters grow in the way that we wish, I know that we are short in time. We are in a race against time, not just to deal with the climate change, but to have a successful COP in November. I think if we are managing to do better in the adaptation, if we are managing to do better in investments, have a new definition on finance to be more fair than what we saw in Copenhagen, and to see more projects that we can showcase, not just the one mentioned by Vera, but in South Africa, but could be more of it with partnerships between the public and the private sector, and more on the adaptation side, and more as well, which we're working on now, on issues related to debt management and debt swaps, and avail more investments to climate agenda. By that, I think we can really be on a way to for a successful COP. Back to you, Dean Fahmy.
Thank you, Dr. Mohideen. Thank you very much. Excellent addition to what Dr. Songwe mentioned, and I think both of you have given a lot of food for thought for the audience and for the two discussants. I have a comment to make, but out of courtesy to my colleague, Dr. Ramadan, would you like to have
No, please
first?
please go ahead, Dean Fahmy. Please go ahead with your comment. I'll have a question later.
Sure. I mean, my basic comment to both of you, and if I may, I put my previous hat as a practitioner. What you've said makes a lot of sense, but we seem to be extremely late, because you can't go to the conference with these ideas. They need to be put forward, negotiated, processed 6-7 months earlier than that. So give me some confidence that there are actually concrete ideas that are being discussed within Africa and with the donors or the international institutions, because frankly, making an announcement in Sharm el-Sheikh is not really going to be the best way to try to get a deal. COP26, PR-wise, it's a great success. You read the details, frankly, much less concrete than what you assume. And I would add to that we already were starting very, very late. So are there projects being actually discussed with the different stakeholders that take into account what is clearly an African need, and I think also, if I may say, an African right, given that we do so little in affecting the climate negatively and deserve to do much more, have much more opportunity development-wise. Dr. Ahmed, I'd like to add at this point, or would you like them to answer first?
No, they can go ahead and answer.
Please,
My
either
question is
Dr.
more
Mohideen
specific.
or Dr. Songwe.
Well, I could start, maybe.
Please.
No, I think that's you're spot on. And if you remember, Dr. Mohideen started by saying that we postponed COP26 because there was COVID. And now we have another global crisis, and so there is conversations about readiness. But I think and those conversations are justified and should go on. But my sense is we had so much expectation for COP26, and had, as Africa anyway, started doing some things with the expectation that maybe COP26 is going to go a little bit further along and we will have things to deliver. So yes, there's been some work that is on the way. A couple of initiatives around, for example, I talked about what I like to call investment for climate swaps. Many people call it debt for climate swaps. We have a couple of conversations on that going along, which could become announceables and real initiatives by COP. We have a conversation around the cost of green bonds on the continent. Our margins are almost 3 to 4 times. Actually, there is no difference between an African green bond and a plain vanilla bond, if you take the case of Egypt, for example, and which means there's something awfully wrong with the market and the way markets price the efforts that we do towards climate change on the continent, and how they price it for others. And so essentially we've done some work around that also, which is on the way and can probably see, most likely will see the day, not probably, but certainly see the light of day by November. I think where we need a little bit more work, and Dr. Mahmoud was talking about that, is really around the environmental and social and governance guidelines. And essentially, you know, the voluntary mechanisms I talked about, you know, $75 in Europe and $5 on the continent. We need to sensitize our regulators more. We need to sensitize our negotiators more. But we also need to understand what are the 4 or 5 criteria that are needed, and then make sure that we can deliver on them. And that if we cannot deliver on them, we go to COP, not postponing the discussion, but asking for waivers. so that we can begin to benefit from these market mechanisms while we adjust. It's similar to the Basel, in the sort of governance banking sector. We adopted the Basel framework, but we asked for more time to comply, right? So we could begin to benefit from some of the things that we're putting in place while ensuring that we do full compliance. So I think there are things like that we're already looking at and can certainly go. And then there are projects where essentially we can already begin to look at where we know huge asset managers, huge fund managers that are looking to invest in more sustainable, more green projects. And we need to sort of collate them. In Egypt, for example, tons of waste management, solid waste management, hydrogen projects that are on the way. So we can put those forward as part of the offer for COP27 and go there with something really concrete and solid as we go forward.
Well, if I may just in a minute, I think I agree very much with what Dr. Sungwi just mentioned. And the other thing that in Glasgow, there have been a lot of promises of things to be done by Sharm el-Sheikh. So there have been lots of work that started already from November to be finished in a deadline in November 2022. And on that, lots of work on issues related to finance, matters related to the revision of the NDCs. This is more on the formal discussions. But in the projects where, as mentioned, the case of Africa, and even if we're taking more on the holistic approach, we could really be seeing lots of examples to be showcased well before November. And the discussion that we have been having today with the aggregators, with the Federation of Egyptian Industry, with the Federation of Egyptian Banks and their associations, the chambers of commerce. It's basically about these kind of partnership that we need really to work on, showcase them in a form of roundtables and events from now and until November. So when November comes, you will be seeing all of these kind of examples of collaboration in the field that should be highlighted. The other thing, that those who committed the $130 trillion of assets under management are now keen to deliver, because there are many question marks about the announcement and what's being delivered. They put some conditions. Now there is a pipeline of projects. So the magic of matchmaking is required to be done by the likes of the IFC, by the African Development Bank, by other IFIs. And there could be some good news here, because I know that there are a couple of projects that could be just scaled up and to be more aligned with with climate change. But you are very much right. As we are late in achieving the targets under the Paris Agreement, we are very much as well late for many years in how to push these claims and pledges into projects in the field, and how to link them to jobs, and how to link them to poverty reduction. And I think the opportunity there, and there are many examples that we are going to be showcasing more. I see the opportunities despite the odds. Unmute, Dean Fahmy. We cannot hear you.
I apologize. I was just saying thank you both. Your comments are at least an indication to us all that there is serious work being done, and hopefully that will result in concrete projects and announcements by the time of COP27. I just want to throw in a point. Almost 20 years ago, when I was in Washington early on in the early 2000s, I had dinner with the chairman of GE, Welch. And at the time, in a big business council, he surprised everybody by saying the success of even his own company was based on how smart it was in going green early and investing in that sector early. And he presented conceptually the parameters as not only the profitability of the company per se itself, but the efficiency of the economy, and therefore opening of doors for his economy, for his company. So I do believe in the holistic, comprehensive approach to this. I'm just worried about the equitability of the process and whether, if you want, the developed world will seriously take on the challenge that they have a responsibility to help us help ourselves as we move forward. I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Ramadan, but I also want to tell the audience that any of you who have questions, please feel free to use the raise hand icon, and I'll be happy to give it to you at that point. Dr. Ramadan.
Thank you, Dean Fahmy. I mean, I raised one question, and it's quite specific. So, I mean, the thoughts of both our guests on the factors or the points that need to be the primary points that need to be addressed to make or to more widely facilitate green bonds in Africa.
Either of you want to respond to that?
Oh, sorry. You're asking for what do we need to do? I think the first big thing that we need to do is have a conversation with the rating agencies, because essentially the pricing comes through that. And we don't yet have for Africa the clarity or the harmonization or the standardization that Europe has. And Europe has done it. Essentially, it says a voluntary mechanism, but as you know, you have non-binding and then it becomes binding. Europe has come together and put together a voluntary mechanism, which for all intensive purposes is now being used as a benchmark for pricing. Given that Africa hasn't done that, it's very difficult. There are 3 or 4 things that need to happen, at least basic, and I just give you sort of the headline titles, and we are, as the Economic Commission for Africa, working on it. The first is updating having the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, first done, submitted. The second then is doing something that's called the biannual update report, which means every 2 years, you must revise and update your submissions in terms of what you're going to do along the lines for improving the climate. The third, and which has become the more difficult, is around the whole sort of certification processes. And essentially, and certification, there's a whole industry now on greenwashing and non-greenwashing. And that's where it's very important for Africa to come together with a single voice to determine what it is that is being called green, what is it that is, how it's measured, and essentially the DNA of carbon. What carbon do we price? Forest carbon is different from agricultural carbon, is different from oceans carbon. And he who decides, the need, puts the price on it, but Africa is doing the offers. And so essentially we should be on the table when the sort of those price differentials are being set, and we haven't done that yet. So because there is a kind of vacuum in the system for us, both the rating agencies, but even those looking for carbon, then have the right to determine that our carbon is not as climate saving as alternative carbon, even for the same kinds of DNA. Just because we're on a different continent. So those are the things we really need to work with rating agencies, and then adhering at the minimum to the European common standards. And this is why the COP is important, and as Africa goes there, to see what is it that we cannot do and ask for some time, and what is it that we want that everybody else is not doing that we need them to do, because at the end of the day, we're protecting for Africa as well. And so we need to ensure that the standards are put in place. So I give you a very easy one, and then I stop there. Secondhand cars, for example, or plastics, right? Rwanda and Costa Rica were the ones who put in place the bill for plastics. It's finally passed against a lot of resistance from petrochemicals and plastics companies that are not African. Of course, the profits are not coming to our continent. Secondhand cars, the requirement for standardization or for meeting car standards, when you break them in Europe, then the car gets exported to Africa. There is no conditionality that says, before you export a car to Africa, make sure that you meet all the environmental standards. Africa, of course, doesn't have the capacity to test and insure all those cars. So a very simple mechanism that says, there is a carbon credit for, or a carbon negative for every country that exports secondhand cars to Africa without having tested them, will be something that the Europeans will have no interest in putting in the framework, but which Africa should immediately put on that framework, for example.
Dr. Mahmoud?
Yeah, if I may just, on the issue of standards and concepts and procedures, the industry is all over the place. There is more than $2.9 trillion managed by thousands of funds around the world. And the issue on lack of standardization had been making many people frustrated and concerned about where their money is going. Dr. Sogli just mentioned the concerns about greenwashing, and they are very much legitimate. And even if you are going to verify what some of these 2,900 funds are doing with their trillions, there are different approaches and different standards and different ways of doing them. So you cannot really compare and assess performance if you are investing. The solutions to that came recently, and that was announced in Glasgow and is going to be hopefully progressing by November. A committee led by the former Minister of Environment and Climate from Canada, Catherine McKenna, with a dozen and more of experts. Their role is to develop the procedures, guideline, and the standards to be followed. And hopefully they have the mandate from the Secretary General, who appointed this or formed this committee, is to finish the work by the end of the year, but we need to see some progress before that. They will be providing the guidelines for all of these ESG-based kind of investments, environment, social, and governance, including the green bonds. And that hopefully will minimize as well the transaction costs associated with issuance of these bonds, because some of the issuers, be them governments or municipalities or corporates, see them more expensive than their counterparts of conventional means of funding because of the verification processes. So there is an awareness of this issue, and the industry need to be developed further, but the transparency and governance rules need to be developed as well. So I'm happy that there is some good progress in that front. Dean Fahmy, apology, I have another, as I told you, that I have another commitment that I have to leave for. I'm sorry that I will not really be able to continue this important discussion, but many thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. We'll continue for another 10 minutes or so with Dr. Songwe, but thank you very much for being with us. I have two questions here from the chat. First of all, and I'll give them both at the same time, and Dr. Songwe, feel free to answer it in whichever way you are comfortable. First question comes from Radwa Sami, asking about how can we help affected countries from Africa in bearing the cost of the negative impact of climate change on women in particular. That's one question. And the other question, which was addressed to both of you, was from Alexander Dufour. What's the best way to encourage the private sector to buy in to realizing this process of net zero by 2050? What do we really need to offer? Because it's clear that depending on governments alone, whether politically or given the present environment internationally, is not going to give the results we want. And I think you mentioned that excellently in your first comment. Dr. Songwe?
Thank you very much, Dean Fahmy, and the questions from Ms. Dufour. And I think on the gender conversation, I think two things. The first one is a cooking stove, and it's not a problem for Egypt per se, but it is a problem for the continent, for Latin America, and for Southeast Asia. We still have across the globe at least 23 million women who die every year from respiratory diseases of some sort because of poor cooking practices. And so clearly there is a conversation there. And this is where part of that whole conversation around gas as a transition fuel was an important one. Because essentially, if we can move to gas as a transition fuel, then you begin to get clean cooking stoves that you can transition many more people onto. We've seen a little bit the disasters that happen in the Amazon because, you know, we let the forest be cut down for different purposes and how that ended up. So I think one thing clearly that is a gender sensitive element of the whole climate change agenda is, you know, respiratory diseases, cooking mechanisms, cooking techniques that can change both in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The second thing, of course, is affordable, the green transition for energy. Affordable energy, we argue, if you're transitioning from fossil fuels and or transitioning from coal into clean energy, cleaner energies, you have a lot more women then that can get into small and medium enterprise businesses because the interesting thing about, you know, renewable energy is that you can actually do a lot of distributed work. And the Rockefeller Foundation and Commission for Ending Energy Poverty, which I'm a member, has done a lot of work that shows that, you know, with renewable energy, all these distributed systems, and I think Egypt is a very good example of that, because you require slightly smaller capital, can actually crowd in a lot more women businesses in that segment of the market. So you crowd in a little bit more business into it. The third thing is, of course, with energy and renewable energy and this transition, digitization is 40% energy. And we know that the digital economy or the service economy is an economy that is maybe skewed almost towards many more women in the workforce. So there is a sort of secondary or third order effect. The more digitized, the more energy access, the more digitization, the more women in the labor force. So again, a very strong relationship, and ECA has done a lot of work on this. Happy to share some of the work we've done with you. We also saw that small and medium enterprises, particularly the ones that are run by women, survived and did much better during the crisis than those who, the small and medium enterprise businesses that were not digitized. So again, there was a sort of a bias there during the crisis that showed more resilience. On the second question, what can we do to make business more interested in climate? Business doesn't start off with its objective to be interested in climate. Business starts off with its objective to increase shareholder value. I think this is why we want them to exist. So the only way that one can make them a little bit more attuned is that the shareholders demand it. And I think what we are beginning to see increasingly is that shareholders are demanding. And so there's two ways of pressuring business. It's one, shareholders demand, and we're seeing increasingly that. We saw that with a lot of the shareholders of German automotive companies that forced essentially Volkswagen and the rest to put dates on when they will move to electric vehicles as part of why the CEO will stay in business. Once you have that as the incentive, then you can get it. So there's a carrot, there's a stick. The other stick is, of course, the consumers. Consumers are beginning to be more discerning. Consumers will not buy whatever the commodity is if it's wrapped in plastic. Maybe they buy so essentially it's the choices that we make as consumers that can also determine and force the private sector to move from one segment of the market to another. And then if we are lucky, women on boards are more environmentally sensitive, and they can also change decisions.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions on the chat, but let me also throw in one of my own, because you partially mentioned it. I was in a discussion this morning about climate change and whether or not the climate change agenda was taking into account enough public health issues. Not only the question that you answered, but generally speaking, the effects of climate change on public health. And my counterpart at the time was actually very critical that he felt it was not, and I frankly did not know the answer, so I didn't claim otherwise. But there are two other questions from the chat. One from our colleague Ali Haouni here at the university, and he was mentioning correctly that COP22 was in Marrakesh, first time in Africa. first time for COP in Africa. And he was asking, what are the lessons from COP22 that we can take into COP27, especially regarding the African agenda per se? And I'm sorry to throw all the questions at you at the same time, but the last question I have here for the time being, which I think you addressed partially already, is frankly a direct question. What should global actors, particularly the major developing countries, but for that matter, also the multinationals, do to address the losses and damages that climate change impacts on Africa?
No, those are two very, I would say, good questions, but probably not as easy answers. On the first one, in terms of what we've learned from Marrakesh and what we need to take into COP27 in Sham, I think the first thing, and my sense is that we are probably doing a little bit of it. Sometimes we tend to be maybe too critical on ourselves as well. Is I think working as a continent, and you know what we're doing here is precisely that. And maybe it's because of COVID, and we can do consultations in many different ways. But I think the effort to bring the continent on to COP27 with one voice, talking about, you know, not letting the world define for us, you know, what it is that should be the conversation and how and what that solution should look like, but us being at the middle of it and you know, and having all the conversations, the Egyptian foreign minister going across the continent, in Addis Ababa, the permanent rep at the African Union, you know, soliciting ideas, soliciting solutions, African environment ministers already meeting finance ministers, having a conversation on sort of the road to it. I think that kind of consultation is what is going to deliver for Africa an optimal solution. And my sense is that some of that is being done already. And so we need to continue that. You know, again, the COP is by its nature a collective global agreement, but there is still a G7 and a G20 that kind of are the sort of powers of the conversation. Are we going to be able to turn that around and bring them to the table in different ways? Not so sure. And so I think there is maybe a lot more conversation that needs to be had with the Indians and the Brazilians that are going to be coming to the COP with different demands and different requests that sometimes may be going against what sort of collective Africa requires. And then those are a few that I can think of, but I would say that we shouldn't be maybe overly pessimistic about not having learned from Marrakesh. I think we have. Have we learned everything, or are we implementing everything we learned? Maybe not. But I think we're halfway. On the what was the second question? On the question on the financing, was that it? On financing, my sense is, and that's why I'm a believer in market mechanisms. I think that the global community, the development partners, as well-intentioned as they may be, we're already at below 0.7 just on regular development aid. And so essentially climate is an additionality. You know, the pain that we're having because of climate change is an additional cost to all of us in our development. And so what global actors need to do, and some of them are doing very well, and we're grateful for that, is already just helping to sort of get the developed community to stay at the 0.7 commitment for development, right? And not use that 0.7 commitment now as part of the climate response, right? Is there, what is the additionality for this excesses? Because we are still within the same envelopes to deal with COVID, to deal with the Ukraine, to deal with food, fuel, fertilizer, the 4 Fs, as Mahmoud said. And I think pressure from NGOs, pressure from the academic community with reports that demonstrate the impact of this is going to be quite important. I think if we can get global swirls of conversations from particularly our non-state actors, indigenous peoples on the impact, and more voice about what needs to be done, we probably will be able to get a little bit further. But the scientific community is mission critical, and just to sort of come to that part of the conversation, I think what we have seen with COVID is that the African scientific community was able to come together. And yes, maybe in the beginning, we got reprimanded because we discovered the Omicron virus, but we got respect as well because we discovered the Omicron virus and because we had the kind of capacity that was able to bring that to the table and have those conversations. So I think our intellectual community is going to be an important part because we can do the analysis that demonstrates that we're being heard much better, much faster than our peers. And I think that when we do those analysis, we can ask the questions because we live the questions and we live the problem. And so I think the scientific community on the continent, I think, should be able to come together and do more work on what is needed. Also on the mitigation side, what we can do differently.
Thank you. Thank you for that concluding comment. We've regularly, legitimately raised the point that we think Africa has not been, if you want, for lack of a better term, been treated equitably in this process. And I think it's a very justified, correct point to raise. But because I may be a little bit less optimistic than some others in terms of the developed world will suddenly change and decide to be more equitable. And this does not mean at all that I'm removing the pressure from the developed world. What can we do as Africans that might help our situation, if not the overall global situation, better? But is there something that we can actually do together as Africans? And I want to underline the point you just made. I think the African handling of Omicron was exceptional, both in terms of being transparent where others had not been, but also in terms of directing resources to dealing with the issue as quickly as could be. And I think it's something that we should all be proud of.
I fully agree. We don't celebrate it enough, and we should continue to use it. I think, and that sort of is the segue into the answer to your question. Is two things happened during the COVID crisis. One of them was, I think, the sense of African health ministers working together, African finance ministers working together, the African Union working together, and so almost organically, the Africa positions on COVID just came out, right? Because there was the scientists working together, and we could come together and agree on where we wanted to go. So this sort of united vision was quite important. We've seen Africa do that as well under the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So this is no longer sort of a dream that one day we will speak with one voice. We can actually do that. And my sense is we need to keep doing that even more often. And so going into the climate conversations, going into COP27, if we went together as one and demanded that rating agencies, took, climate action as part of their, and then defined it, right? And so part of the conversations we were having today in some of the meetings was, a lot of African financial systems are funding agriculture. So essentially we are funding green, we're funding climate, maybe if we're not funding sugarcane that eats up a lot of water, but a lot of our agriculture produce is actually sustainable. And I think we do need to put some of the rewards that we're doing. I, for one, have stopped talking a lot about Africa didn't cause climate change and we're suffering and somebody needs to help us. I think we should talk about Africa is saving the climate. When you look at the peatlands of the Congo, right, we're sequestering 3 years of carbon. I just did a TED talk on it. I'm asking everybody to look at it, saying that's trillions of dollars that we've saved the world in terms of sequestering carbon. We should be asking for compensation for that and saying this is an economic good, and an economic good that now has a market value and that we should be rewarded for it. I think those kinds of conversations, we know that if we could put them in place, then we will accelerate our growth and get to a place that is globally consistent for everybody. So we should be able to find some of these things that will work for Africa, the public commons that Africa needs to do. We should fast track some kinds of standardization or harmonization. We shouldn't wait for everybody to do it and then join. We should be part of the decision making as we go forward. And again, a case in point, Africa is now very well advanced on e-commerce regulation and standardization, even as WTO is squabbling about it. We've at least developed something that is African, that when the rest of the world decides to come and sit down and talk about it, we can put something collectively on the table. So we have good examples of how we can come together to make it work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You've responded in the constructively aggressive fashion that always makes us proud of what you're doing. I want to thank you for that. The concluding remark I have here on the chat is actually a very interesting but long comment, so I'm going to summarize it. It comes from Yasser Hassan, who's with the ILO. His basic points, which are correct, are that we cannot succeed without a social consensus on sustainability, and that requires partnerships. And you mentioned that in the very beginning. He adds to it governments, employers, and workers' organizations. Another point he makes is that you can't deal with poverty issues. You can't ignore poverty issues as you try to deal with the environmental issues. And he gives specific examples, charcoal, logging, and all that. I won't repeat them because I know you know them well. And from the audience I see here, they're all educated in the subject. But that's another valid point that is being raised. And then his question really was that NDCs were intended to be bottom up, self-determining innovation of innovation of the Paris Agreement. How many NDCs in Africa are short-term or running only until 2030? Are they transactional? Is there a focus on specific investments rather than create markets? You could just comment on that last point or any of the other points if you wish.
Actually, and I'll be very short. Interestingly enough, a lot of the Africans, I think, are very practical people, and they have projects. You know, if you talk to the Ministry of Environment or to the banking sector, the private sector, even in Egypt, they'll tell you this. There's a renewable energy project here. There's a wind project here. There is a waste management project here. And so I think what we are looking for actually is not so much the projects or even the NDC, is the financing and how we crowd it in and ensure that we get our money's worth, either financing that takes account that it's a sustainable energy project, so we can crowd in the World Bank or the EIB with concessional funding that makes the project more affordable. So we do have the projects. I think really it's now, you know, crowding in the countries for financing. But the good thing, as Dr. Mahmoud mentioned, is that with this sort of global community of asset managers who now have obligations to invest in clean and renewable energy project or renewable climate sustainable projects, there is now a financing source. So really, what we need to do is ensure that, you know, even if you don't want to create institutions or markets, that the one market for every project clears, right? We have to satisfy the Norwegian pension fund that, you know, the project that you're doing is good. So rather than do that kind of laborious retail, if Africa could come together, at least as Europe has done, voluntary standardization, harmonization of regulation and certification, then we will be one step further. And so the ECA is now working with a group of 16 countries on very specific projects just to document. And I think the Ministry of International Cooperation in Egypt is also trying to put together a booklet that will give us a sense of what are the steps, what is the walkthrough process for this, and how can you get it done. So I think if we can fill that little gap of knowledge, information, and sensitization, hopefully we do better.
Thank you. Mr. Hassan, I apologize for missing your fourth point. I didn't see it from the screen, but Dr. Songwe actually answered it anyway on dealing on how to generate more financing. Dr. Ramadan, would you like to add anything at this point? Fine. Well, Dr. Songwe, I promised you to try to keep it to 75 minutes. We're actually 4 minutes beyond that, and that's an exceptional record by Egyptian standards, not to be too late. So, but you've really made this opportunity worthwhile for us all. I very much thank you for being with us today, and do hope that we'll be able to meet personally, face-to-face sometime in the future. And I can tell you we will be following your work and providing support for you as we get closer to COP27. Thanks also to Dr. Mahideen. Of course, he's not here, but I find a way to convey my thanks and thanks to Dr. Ramadan for joining with me on this project. And of course, to all of those in the audience, once again, you've made the Tahrir Dialogues a very useful and worthwhile endeavor. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon or good evening, and happy Ramadan.
Thank you and happy Ramadan. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Bye-bye, Dr. Songwe. Thank you.
Thank you.